Hello and welcome to Sam-Splaining Science. I'm Sam, I'm your host. I'll be Sam-Splaining the science, and today we're talking about tattoos. But before we get into tattoos, I just wanted to recap last week's episode. Last week, episode 45, I posted, was the return from my little year and a half long sabbatical. It's called The Comeback Kid, and I talked a lot about what is changing now that I'm bringing the show back, what isn't changing, and what you can expect moving forward. And some of those expectations for the show moving forward are that I will be posting videos when I can on Mondays. So happy Monday if you're watching this when it comes out, or audio listening. But yeah, happy Monday. I hope you enjoyed the first episode. I had a lot of people reach out saying they were excited to see that it was back. So I really do appreciate that. And looking forward to Sam-splaining more science and hearing what you all have to say. And if you have any suggestions for future episodes, I've actually already gotten a couple, so that's exciting. But any suggestions for future episodes, definitely let me know. As I mentioned in the previous episode, I talked a lot about things that have changed since I started my sabbatical. I'm going to call it a sabbatical because it sounds professional and it sounds like it was intentional, even though it kind of wasn't. But since I started my sabbatical, I noted that a few things changed. One being the recording platform that I'm using. So I'm using a new video recording platform, and I learned, one, that this box stays. Oh, now you can see that whatever. There's a box on the recording screen that shows you like how long you've been recording for. So right now I've been recording for a little over 3 minutes, even though this video has not been 3 minutes, but that's fine. But one cool thing that I did learn is that you can do this. Is it going to work? Oh, now it's going to make me look stupid. Amazing. Okay, hold on. Oh, there it goes. It was there for... My computer's also 100 years old, so it lags like crazy. But there's a little confetti feature. There she is. She's very delayed. But, yeah, so that's cool and fun. But other than that, I have to push this off to the side so that you don't see the countdown clock in the video. Audio people are like, what the hell is she talking about? I completely agree. What am I talking about? So one thing that changed was the recording platform, but another thing that I did not mention in last week's episode is another thing that changed since I started recording, or since I took my sabbatical, is that I got a tattoo. What? I am someone who has never had a tattoo. I've always wanted one, never really knew what to get or what I wanted or who I wanted to be the artist or like whatever. And then just kind of impromptu on a trip with my friends in California, I was like, you know what? I'm going to get a tattoo. So I'm going to try to show it on the video. I could post a picture too, because it'll probably look better online. But it's on my upper arm. And this is not a good angle of it. Hold on. Let me rotate. Now you probably can't hear me. It's a brain with lilacs growing out of it and butterflies flying around the lilacs. And, a brain is obviously because I've been, well, not obvious to you. I've been in neuroimaging research or neuroimaging work for over a decade of my life. The brain is very, very important to me. I love my brain. I love learning about the brain. So that to me, I was like, this is a good idea for a tattoo. And then the lilacs and the butterflies are more symbols in my family about people who are no longer with us, but now they're still with me in my tattoo. So I am a tatted girl now. I'm different. Things have changed. Just kidding. I'm still the same person. Just sometimes I have art on my arm. And by sometimes, I mean all the time, because it is, in fact, permanent. We'll learn about that in a second. Actually, how many times am I going to say actually? It's a good transition to this episode. So as I said, we're talking about tattoos. And as I was getting my tattoo, I was like, what the hell's going on? First of all, I was like, I can't believe I'm doing this. But secondly, I was thinking I probably should have read up on this more. Like, I probably should have looked into the scientific literature on tattoos because, one, I didn't really understand what was happening and how tattoos even work. Like, how do tattoos stick in your skin? I don't know. Or I didn't know. Now I do. And you're about to know if you don't already know. Spoiler alert. But I also didn't know, like, am I poisoning myself? Like, am I injecting poison into my body? Like, I had no idea. I really did no research at all prior to getting my tattoo, other than like an artist and like what I wanted. And, you know, that sort of research was fine. But, you know, other more biological things I didn't really think about, which is, you know, you would think I would because, hello, have you met me? All I think about is science. But it hit me as I was doing it. I was like, oh, you know what? I have no idea what's happening. So, you know, maybe hindsight, should have known about it. But now I get a podcast episode out of it. So win-win. So yeah, with that, we're going to jump into these questions for this episode that I thought to myself as I was getting a tattoo. The first one is, how do tattoos work? And the second is, are tattoos harmful to my health? So let's jump in. And as always, the references for everything that I use to learn and in turn teach, or sam-splain, I should say, those references will always be in the description of the episode. So feel free to check them out for yourself. There are a couple of scientific papers that if you have any interest in learning more about, feel free to do so. But let's get to getting. Okay. So question number 1, how do tattoos work? So before we get into exactly how tattoos work, sorry if you see me like looking off to the side in the video, I have notes. It's not all fresh off the dome. I do have some notes. So sorry about that. Okay. But before we get into how tattoos work, I thought I would kind of give a brief overview of skin, because the skin is something that we've never really talked about before on this show. It's something that I didn't really remember learning all that much about to a very specific detail. So I had to do a lot of research on it as well. So I figured it's a nice base layer for starting to talk about tattoos is talking about the skin. So the skin is the largest organ in our body, which is kind of wild to think about it as an organ, but it is an organ. Crazy. It, as you know, covers our whole body. It's about 2 millimeters thick, although it can vary in thickness depending on where it is in the body. So like the skin on your hands and your palms and the bottoms of your feet might be thicker than the skin on your wrist or the skin on your face. It varies depending on where it is on the body. But as you're aware, the skin covers all of the outside of our body. And this is a stat that I read on the, I believe it was the NCI link here. The skin weighs about 6 pounds. I could have gone the rest of my life without knowing that. I didn't need to know that, but now I know it, and now you do too. So you're welcome. The function of the skin is to protect. It's to protect the internal organs from the external environment. And the way that it does this is it has many layers that are built up into our actual skin to protect our insides from our outsides. So we're going to talk about those layers of the skin now, because the skin does have layers. That's might be something that you've heard of before, like, oh, I have 12 layers of skin or whatever. We'll get into that. But there are 3 main layers that make up the skin. So we'll talk about each of those and their role in helping the skin do what it needs to do. So firstly, we're going to talk about the epidermis. So the epidermis, I'm going to use my hand as an example, is the outermost part of our skin. So the skin that we see, that we touch, that is our epidermis. It's the very outside. And the epidermis itself is made up of many layers. So the first layer of skin is made up of many layers. Skin has layers. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers. Parfaits have layers. Skin, ogres, onions, parfaits, layers. That would be a really good category for connections. If you play connections on the New York Times, it would be a purple category because it's a very obscure category, but it would be skin, ogres, onions, parfaits, things that have layers. You heard it here first. Okay. If you see it on the New York Times, it's because I called in and recommended a category for connections. Anyway, the epidermis is made up of layers. The very top layer of our skin, there's 4 layers. And we're going to start from the deepest layer, so the layer that we don't see. That's called the basal cell layer, also known as the basement layer. And this is the layer of the epidermis that has the melanocytes. So melanocytes are cells in our skin that give it pigment. This pigment is called melanin, and it gives skin a tan or brown color. So people who have more melanin have darker skin tones, and people who have less melanin have lighter skin tones. And if you have lighter skin but have freckles or birthmarks or darker patches on your skin, that's essentially an area where the melanocytes are producing more melanin than the skin surrounding it. So that's in the basal cell layer of the epidermis. Also, just FYI, these melanocytes, so the cells that produce melanin, are what gets damaged in melanoma. Melanocyte. Kind of close. Okay. But yeah, those are the cells that get damaged in skin cancer, or a type of skin cancer called melanoma. And this layer, in addition to creating pigment, is also making cells constantly. New cells are constantly being generated in this basal cell layer, which is the bottom layer of the epidermis. If we go one level up from the basal cell layer, we get to the squamous cell layer, which is a fire word. Squamous, honestly, one of my top 3 favorite words in the world. Squamous? Come on. That's a good one. So the squamous cell layer, that's the one right above the basal cell layer, is the thickest layer of the epidermis. And in the squamous cell layer, there are what used to be the basal cells, but have since been bumped up. So remember, that basal cell layer is constantly making new cells. So when it makes new cells, it bumps up the older cells into the squamous cell layer. And now that they're in a new layer, those cells have a new name. So they go by squamous cells, or they can also be known as keratinocytes or keratinocytes. I don't know how you'd like to pronounce that. I feel like keratin I've heard of before because it's a protein. And that's exactly what those keratinocytes do. They produce keratin, which is a protein that makes up hair, skin, and nails. So if you've ever heard of like keratin treatments for your hair or your skin or your nails, that's a protein that helps the structural integrity and the strength of your hair, skin, and nail cells. The squamous cell layer also has Langerhans cells, because of course it does. Why wouldn't a cool cell layer name also have cool cell names in it? But the Langerhans cells play a role in the immune response. So basically, if we have a cut on our hand or a cut somewhere on our skin, the Langerhans cells that are in the squamous cell layer can detect if an outside germ or pathogen gets in, and then that cell will alert the immune system. to say, hey, there's something in here that doesn't belong here. Call security. Or I guess the Langerhans cells is the one that calls security, if security is the immune system in this analogy, which I believe it should be. It is. Okay. So that's the squamous cell layer. One layer up from the squamous cell layer, so now this is the third highest layer, or the third layer up, is the stratum granulosum and stratum lucidum. Okay. Now we're taking a turn here. Now things are getting a little weird. But these are the keratinocytes that were in the squamous cell layer that got pushed up even further. Because again, the basal cells get made, they push up the old ones, and then those keratinocytes that were in the squamous cell layer get pushed up again into the stratum granulosum and stratum lucidum. And what happens in this layer is that because these cells are getting pushed up to the surface, they're kind of changing their shape. They're undergoing these morphological changes that make them look and appear different. So they get kind of longer and flatter, and almost they get squished, essentially. That's my understanding. And because they get squished and completely like flattened, by the time they get to this cell layer, they die. So that's the stratum granulosum and the stratum lucidum. And then the very top layer of the epidermis, which is what we actually see, is called the stratum corneum. And that's where dead keratinocytes are. So the outer skin that we see is dead skin. Yum. So the outermost cells on our skin are the oldest cells, the oldest skin cells that we have. And the deepest skin cells in the epidermis are the newer, younger cells. So you can think of this kind of as like a shedding process, if you will, where the total turnover takes about 30 days, but the process of cells turning over, well, it takes 30 days for like younger adults. So like me, because I'm super young. But if you're old, like 40s, just kidding. But for older adults, it does take a little longer. So that turnover of cells takes between 45 to 50 days as you get older. But I don't have to worry about that because I'm really young. For now. Okay, so that's the epidermis. That's the very top layer of the skin. Now we're going to go down to the next of the three main layers of skin, which is called the dermis. So the dermis is beneath the epidermis. And the dermis makes up for most of the thickness of the skin. And it has a lot going on. The goals of the dermis are really to regulate our body temperature. And it also aims to supply the epidermis, which is the area, this layer of the skin that makes pigment and all that stuff, to supply the epidermis with blood and nutrients and all the stuff that it needs in order to constantly regenerate new cells in the basal cell layer of the epidermis. So the dermis is really, or I guess with that being said, before I get into the dermis more specifically, the dermis has a lot of blood vessels because it needs to supply a lot of nutrients to the epidermis, but it also has lymph vessels. So lymph is like liquid that's kind of surrounds our tissues. It has immune cells in them. You might have heard of like lymph nodes. That's kind of where the lymph is created and like filtered. I don't know if filtered is the right word, but you know, like when you're sick and your doctor like feels your lymph nodes, that's because your lymph nodes tend to get swollen or larger when you have an infection, because the lymph, which has a lot of the immune cells, is like producing a lot. That was not an excellent explanation. This is not sam-splains lymph. This is sam-splains tattoos. So let's not get too deep into the forest here. Let's bring it back and just talk about the dermis for now, because the dermis has a lot going on. I kind of like to call it the Barbie of the skin because it can do everything. It can do so much. So the dermis is broken up into two layers. One is the papillary layer and one is the reticular layer. And the papillary layer has collagen fibers, which is another protein that I wonder if you've heard of. I feel like a lot of people online especially are like, drink your collagen and take these and this is not an endorsement of any of those things. It's also not, dismissing them either. It's just something that you may have heard about collagen. I haven't studied this too much, but collagen is a protein that is in the dermal layer of our skin that helps to retain its structure and its elasticity. And particularly in the papillary layer of the dermis, collagen fibers kind of work with blood vessels, so it really upholds the structure to allow blood vessels to run through the dermis. And then again, those blood vessels are supplying nutrients, and blood vessels also play a big role in regulating body temperature. I think that's kind of a conversation for another day. Again, I don't want to get too lost in the forest here. But there are some vascular changes that happen to regulate your body temperature, and the papillary layer allows for that to happen in the dermis. And then the next layer in the dermis is the reticular layer, and that's where more collagen fibers are. These are a little bit thicker collagen fibers, and that's where we really see the function of like the skin elasticity and the skin being able to stretch and move, which is helpful because we move our bodies a lot. And if our skin didn't have this elasticity, we would just be like frozen and stuck and not being able to move our bodies without ripping our skin open. So that's always good. And the reticular layer collagen also provides structural support to things like hair follicles, because that's where our hair follicles start, or is in the dermis of our skin. The dermis also has sweat glands, which is another way it regulates body temperature, right? When we are hot, we sweat. Which reminds me, I didn't bring my sweat napkin. And you can probably tell because I'm already shiny. And how I don't even know how long we've been recording. It doesn't matter. We're going to power through this. Anyway, let's get to the last layer of the skin. You're probably like, Sam, you're supposed to be talking about tattoos. What the hell are you doing? Girl, boy, person, I know. We're getting there. Okay. So the last layer of the skin is called the subcutis or the hypodermis. And this is the innermost layer of the skin. So the top is the epidermis, then we have the dermis, then we have the hypodermis. And this layer of skin is really just made up of fat cells and collagen. And it has three main functions. The first is an insulator. So it really conserves body heat, which is what fat does in our body, is it conserves our body's heat. It also acts as a shock absorber, and this is really to protect inner organs as well. And then, there's only two. I don't know how to count. I do know how to count. My notes are just misleading. So that's my bad. So those are the two. It's an insulator and a shock absorber, and it's the innermost layer of the skin. That was the third thing that I had listed. For some reason, I thought it was a function or a role of the subcutis. It's not. And that's on me. But just also FYI, the subcutis can change, or the hypodermis can change in thickness and vary throughout the body. And then it can also vary from person to person. So when a person says they're thick-skinned, maybe it's their subcutis is a little thicker than the average person. That was a joke. For legal reasons, that was not science. That was a hee-hee-ha joke. Okay, now let's get on to the actual tattoo part, okay? I watched this TED Ed video, which is linked below, that taught me more than any legitimate scientific article that I could find about tattoos. So the TED Ed video linked below, it actually also talks about briefly the history of tattoos, which Sam does not splain history, so I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to touch that. But it was pretty interesting to think about how tattoos have been around for many, many years. And just to kind of give some historical context to tattoos. But what I learned from this video was very informative about how tattoos work in the context of our skin. So if you are not familiar with tattoos, essentially what it is needles or a needle or many needles, depending on how you do it, that has ink in it. And that ink gets injected into your skin, and then oftentimes it is permanent. And, you can get designs. Now I'm mansplaining. This is a mansplaining level. You know what a tattoo is. But if you've never gotten one before, it's like a series of pinpricks with needles that have ink in them. And then the ink gets deposited into the skin and it stays there. So if we want to get more specific, more scientific with it, the pigment is actually injected into the dermis. That's that Barbie layer, middle layer of the skin. That's the most of the thickness of the skin. It has a lot going on. It has the blood vessels. It has the lymph vessels. It has sweat glands. It has hair follicles. It's got it all going on for her, Miss Barbie Dermis. Okay. So what happens is this pigment gets injected into the dermis, and as we know, as you break through the epidermis and it passes through the squamous cell layer, we remember squamous, and we also remember Langerhans cells. The Langerhans cells are the ones that alert the immune system to say, hey, something's breaking through the skin that shouldn't be here, right? And it alerts the immune system, calls security. And then we know that the dermis, which is where the ink is getting injected into, has lymph vessels where the immune cells go. So the immune system is alerted, which is why if you've ever gotten a tattoo, you might notice like redness and like inflammation, because there's a lot of immune response happening in that area. So the immune cells get notified like, hey, something's getting injected that shouldn't be here, and it's painful and it's not good, right? So then your immune cells send their response, and in particular, there's an immune cell called a macrophage. And macrophage, I think we might have talked about macrophages before on this show, but if you haven't listened to the show, that's fine. If this is your first episode, hi, welcome. But macrophages are the immune cells, or a type of immune cell in our system, that their job is really just to eat. What a dream. Oh, to be a macrophage. But essentially they just like chomp up things that don't belong there, right? They identify things that this is foreign, this does not belong in the body, and we're going to chomp it up. So that's exactly what they do when they see the little drops of ink that are in our dermis that aren't supposed to be there. They chomp them up. But the only problem is that when they chomp up the ink is too difficult to actually chomp so that it can leave the body. So it just kind of chomps on the ink, and then it just stays there and it gets stuck in the dermis. And that's why it's permanent, because the body can't do anything with it. The macrophages can't break it down and clear it or release it from our system. So it just kind of stays there and it hangs out in the dermis. Hence the permanent nature of tattoos. However, you might be like, Sam, isn't it possible to remove tattoos? It is, using high energy light, aka lasers. So you can use lasers to target the pigment that's stuck in the dermis, and that laser will break the pigment into smaller pieces, and then those smaller pieces your immune cells can remove. And this might also be, if you've ever gotten a tattoo, you might have been told to use SPF or like some sort of sunblock or sun protectant on your tattoo, because the UV rays from the sun also contribute to this breaking down of the pigment of the ink that is injected. So it happens slowly over time, a lot of times, unless you use like the laser to really zap it. But if you're just like out in the sun, it will fade naturally over time. And also the body does naturally slowly break it down. So, you know, if you got a tattoo when you're 18, it's not going to look as crisp when you're 41. But it'll still be there. You'll still be able to see it, you know? So that's how tattoos work. That's question 1. That took about an hour and a half, it feels like. I'm sorry. But you know me, I like to get specific with the details because more knowledge never hurt anybody. Never say never. But typically more knowledge does not hurt people. So I like to share what I can. So that's the tattoo part. Again, the TED Ed video is linked if you want to listen to it or watch it. That's where these little graphics are from. But yeah, I hope you learned something here about how tattoos work. So now we're going to move on to question number 2, which is, are tattoos harmful to my health? And I divided this question into 2 because one is probably more scientifically established, and the other is still a lot of like, I don't knows. So I kind of want to talk about things that are really well defined and things that we have a good grasp on first, and then get into the other stuff in the second half. So the first half, we're going to talk about infections, and that includes both viral and bacterial infections. So before we get into the specific papers that talk about viral and bacterial infections, I kind of want to talk about the difference between what a viral infection is and what a bacterial infection is, because you might say, oh, I have an infection, but depending on what it is, you might be getting a different treatment depending on what it is. And that's just because of the nature of the infection. Okay. So a viral infection is something that's caused by a virus. So viruses are technically not alive. They can't really be classified as living until they enter a living cell. So like if a virus is sitting by itself on a counter or wherever it is, I just decided it's on a counter, but it could be on a doorknob or anywhere, it's not going to be able to reproduce because it doesn't really have the machinery in its viral capsule to reproduce. What it needs is a living cell to take that virus in, and then that virus hijacks that cell and uses that cell's machinery to reproduce. And this is something that I've talked about back in my episodes on COVID-19, because SARS-CoV-2 is a virus that causes COVID. So that's a viral infection. A bacterial infection is something that is caused by bacteria. And bacteria are different from viruses because bacteria are alive. They are single-celled organisms, so they are kind of fully functional on their own in a way. But they can also get into your body and they can infect you and start reproducing, and they can spread. And that kind of makes them different, or in a way similar to viruses, because they can infect you, but they're different because they're kind of self-sustaining in a way. If you've ever had a bacterial infection, you've probably taken antibiotics because antibiotics are used to treat bacterial infection. So if you've ever had strep throat and you've gotten, I had strep throat all the time as a kid, and they always gave me that, I forget the name of the medicine now. Oh, I'm not going to remember, but I remember it tasted like bubble gum. And I used to not like getting strep, obviously, because it wasn't fun, but I used to love the medicine because it literally tastes like bubble gum. Is it penicillin? No, amoxicillin. That was that good shit. I'll tell you that. As a kid, I didn't like strep throat. I loved some amoxicillin. And recently I had strep throat, or something going on in my throat, and they gave me amoxicillin, and I was like, yes, and then it was a pill. Bummer. Anyway, TBT. Okay, so viral and bacterial infections. Let's get back on track, Sam. So that's the difference between them. But I will say you can prevent them in similar ways. And getting back to getting a tattoo, if you've ever gotten a tattoo, and I don't mean to exclude people who've never gotten tattoos, because I keep saying that. If you've ever gotten a tattoo, but if you haven't, just so you know, if you're getting a tattoo at a good place that's legitimate, the area where you're sitting should be freaking spotless. It should be sanitized. It should be wiped down. The artist should be wearing gloves 100%. If they're not, 911 jail. Everything should be wiped down. Everything should be sanitized. New needles, everything clean, because if it's not clean, viruses and bacteria could be on the surfaces where you are, and then that risks infection. So that's kind of why I want to talk about viral and bacterial infections, because if you get a tattoo at a sketchy place where they don't keep their things clean, there's a risk that you can get an infection. So I have two papers cited here. One is a review paper that talks about viral infections. The other talks about bacterial infections. So the viral infection paper, which is written by Cohen, Dr. Cohen. I don't know if it's a man or a woman. I only have their initials. It doesn't matter. Dr. Cohen, regardless. They talk about viral infections that have been associated with tattoo inoculation. So basically they take this summary of other, what's the word? My brain is not working well today. Other publications about viral infections that have happened during or after that have been associated with a tattoo inoculation or a tattoo session. What they found were a few examples. The most common example in this paper was a virus called the human papillomavirus, or HPV, as well as molluscum contagiosum, which sounds like a Harry Potter spell. Each of these viruses can cause local reactions, so like bumps on the skin. And I think that's typically, at least in this paper, what is reported. But then there's also, more rarely, citations of rubella and smallpox, which are rare, thank you to vaccines, because we can be vaccinated against rubella with our MMR shot, and smallpox was pretty much eradicated because of vaccines. So these are ultra rare, but the study did find a smallpox infection or a rubella infection that was associated with somebody who had gotten a tattoo. So not dismissing it as, oh, this isn't real, but in a way dismissing it because vaccines have made it so that those things are typically not a problem, at least where I am in the United States, and where I've gotten a tattoo, which was, again, in the United States. So again, these viruses, the HPV, the molluscum contagiosum, rubella, smallpox, these are typically lesions that we see on the skin. But there were also some citations of blood-borne viruses like hepatitis B and hepatitis C, as well as the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. And these are also possible as antigens. And the reason why is because as the ink is getting injected into the dermis, as we know, the dermis has a lot of blood vessels because it's supplying all the nutrients to the epidermis, which is making all the new skin cells. So the dermis has a lot of blood vessels that, as you can imagine, if you're getting stabbed with a needle multiple times, those blood vessels are breaking open. So a lot of these blood-borne pathogens or viruses that can transit through blood, like Hep B, Hep C, and HIV, there's also a risk of transmitting or getting those viruses when you get a tattoo. So they talk about some suspected causes about the cases. And again, this is all suspicion, right? There's no proof like, oh, this person got rubella because they got a vaccine, or because, there's no proof saying this person got rubella because they got a tattoo at this tattoo shop on this day, right? There's no receipt like that, but there are hypotheses as to how these infections may have come from a tattoo appointment. And the main hypotheses are virus-contaminated instruments, virus-contaminated ink, or both were used during the tattooing. So again, just stressing, get your tattoo in a clean place, please, so that you minimize your risk for getting these viruses. So that was the first article. Again, that was about viral infections. Now we're going to switch gears to the next article by Diekman, which talks about bacterial infection after tattooing. So in this study, they cover 67 cases of serious bacterial infections, which included both local infections, so like just infections on the skin, as well as systemic infections. Words are hard for me today and every day. So they're essentially saying that there could be local reactions and local infections as well as systemic, meaning that it infects your whole body, right? And these are things like septic shock. These are things like endocarditis, which is an infection of the heart tissue. So, and I guess maybe just to explain the systemic nature of some of these infections, again, when you jab your dermis, you're going to break some blood vessels. And blood, as you may be aware, is everywhere. So once it gets into your blood circulates all over your frickin' body. And it does it repeatedly many, many times a day. So if an infection or if a bacteria gets into your blood, baby, it's everywhere. It can go anywhere it wants to. So that's not great. And there's something called septic shock, which you may be familiar with. Sepsis, this is when the infection is in your blood. And it's not good. It can be deadly. Typically, you have to go to a hospital if you have it. You get treated with IV. But if you don't catch it early enough, it could kill you. It's very, very serious. So that is just a note about systemic infections and how they could spread through the blood to the whole body. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to check my notes again. Oh, another thing that they note, sorry. Sorry for the long pause. I'm just reading here. Another thing that they note is that because the needles are like jabbing through the epidermis through to the dermis, it causes a lot of damage, as you can imagine. And that makes the cells a little weaker. So they get kind of worn down. They're not as strong in like the days to weeks after getting a tattoo. And because of that, it can make it easier for bacteria to get in past that barrier and get into the dermis, which again can cause infection, either systemic in the blood or locally, which would be things like blisters or abscesses, things like redness, cellulitis caused by different types of bacteria, like a strep bacteria or a staph bacteria or MRSA. Yeah. So that's why when you get a tattoo, or if you choose to get a tattoo, you should absolutely keep it clean for the days after. And honestly, weeks after. Make sure you wash it multiple times a day. Don't go to places that are particularly germy. And just make sure that you're taking good care of it. The paper also cited some evidence that sources of these bacterial infections could have come from, again, contaminated equipment as well as contaminated ink, which when I read this, I was like, are you kidding? This is horrifying. This is like, I never would have thought. I would have thought obviously like the needles being clean, but the ink, do they not regulate that? And the answer is they didn't until like last year, 2 years ago. In 2022, the U.S. Congress passed the, quote, Modernization of Cosmetics Regulation Act. So now the FDA regulates tattoo inks, or it should be regulating tattoo inks because it's being injected into the body as a cosmetic. The fact that they didn't do that before is literally frightening, because that's how some people have gotten these bacterial infections, apparently, because there have been contaminants in tattoo ink. Horrifying. But the good news is that in 2023, they issued a draft of the guidance to the FDA for how to regulate tattoo ink, just to make sure that the risks for contamination of bacteria, of viruses, and even of mold, I'm throwing up, that's disgusting, that all of those contaminants don't get in tattoo ink. So, sorry if you have a tattoo and you didn't know that. I'm very sorry that I had to be the one to tell you that. But the good news is that they're now regulating it, hopefully. So there's that. Okay. But yeah, I think the takeaway from this question is that it's so important to make sure that your station where you're getting tattooed is sanitized, that they're using fresh, clean equipment, new needles. That's a given. But also that you practice good hygiene after you get a tattoo. Because remember, this is essentially an open wound. You just stabbed yourself for 4 hours. So it's an open wound. You got to make sure you keep it clean, that it heals properly, not only so that it looks good and it heals nicely to make it look good, but also so that it heals nicely so that you don't get a staph infection. Just a friendly reminder. Okay. So that's the first half of, are tattoos harmful to my health? Potentially, but there are things that we can do to make sure that they are not. So we should do them. Now let's go to the next question, which is a scary one. But I don't know if it'll probably scare you if you have a tattoo. But there's good news. In a way, no news, which sometimes no news is good news. Anyway, the next question, just say it, Sam, just spit it out. The next question is, do tattoos cause cancer? Now imagine my surprise when I Googled tattoos and health, and it said tattoos and lymphoma. Excuse me? Now, I was sitting there with my fresh tat on my arm in tears, essentially. I'm like, did I just give myself cancer? No, relax. Rein it in, Sam. Because I'll give you the spoiler alert up front. I go through 2 papers here, talking one about skin cancer, one about lymphoma. Both of the conclusions of these papers are, we need more information. There's not enough information in these papers, which are not perfect, to draw a conclusion that tattoos cause cancer. And before I get into this, I do want to put forth a friendly reminder that correlation does not imply causation. Just because 2 things are associated with each other does not mean one causes the other. There's an episode on this. I think it's Let's Talk About Stats, Baby. It might have been that one. It might have been a different one. Where I talk about correlations. I talk about spurious correlations. It's a whole convo. I'm not going to get into it right now. But if you're interested, you can go back and look for it. But the takeaway here is just because 2 things are correlated does not mean that one causes the other. Okay. Had to get that out there. So the question, do tattoos cause cancer? I have 2 papers cited below. One is by Dr. Lebhar and colleagues, and they have a study surrounding an increase in cutaneous malignancies, which I take to mean skin cancer, in tattoos over time. And essentially, this paper is talking about, well, tattoos have become more popular over time, and we've also seen an increase in published reports of skin malignancies in tattoos. But just because there's an increase in published reports doesn't mean there's an increased incidence. Do you know what I mean? There's a difference there. And this paper acknowledges that limitation. But they do talk about how more and more publications are coming out citing case studies that there are skin cancer lesions in a tattoo or near a tattoo. And there are a lot of studies that are looking into validating, like preclinically, mechanisms by which tattoos might be causing skin cancer. A lot of the hypotheses right now are talking about how there are like chemicals in the ink and different pigments of ink, like red ink is one, I believe, that when they're broken up by UV rays could be carcinogenic. Again, this is all like preclinical. Like we do not have the proof that this is what is happening. These are hypotheses. Another hypothesis includes that because there's damage to the dermis past the epidermis, where the basal cell layer has our melanocytes, that causing damage to these skin cells put them at an increased risk for mutations that can lead to cancer. So that's another, again, hypothesis. But the authors in this paper acknowledged that there's a lot more work to be done on this, right? Like they're saying like, okay, this is an observation that we've made, but and of like a study of one making this observation is not good enough, right? We need fully controlled, in a way, studies. We need better designed studies to prove, one, that there's even a connection between skin cancer and tattoos, and two, if there is a connection, how does that happen, right? There's still a lot more that we need to know to make sure that this is even a topic of concern. So like from a study like this, when we're looking at a few compiled cases and case reports, it's really hard to prove that tattoos cause skin cancer. It's not there in this study, right? Or even that they're associated with a higher risk of skin cancer, right? There are hypotheses why this could be, but in this paper, there's not enough data to support this point. And at this point, the authors just kind of make a call for scientists and researchers to look into this more, that maybe this is something that we should be looking into to better understand. But there's really no news on this front. And at least that's how I took this paper. And again, it's linked below if you'd like to read it. But that's what I took away from it. So, do tattoos cause skin cancer? I don't know. Does that make you feel better? Probably not. But I never claimed that my job was to make you feel better. That's not why I'm here. I'm here to educate, baby. Didn't I just say earlier that more information doesn't hurt people? Whoops. Anyway, this is this is a lack of information. That's the thing. And that's what's frustrating about science sometimes. But, you know, it just means that we have more work to do, which is exciting for the researchers who get to do it. Not me, though. God bless. Okay, let's move on to the next paper that I cited, Do Tattoos Cause Cancer? The next paper just came out in June of this year, 2024, by Dr. Nielsen and colleagues in Sweden, which I believe is one of the happiest places to live in the world. So shout out to Sweden. Maybe I'm thinking of Switzerland. I might get them confused sometimes. I wouldn't be able to point out either one on a map, but that's none of your business. Okay. So Dr. Nielsen and colleagues in Sweden investigated the association between tattoo exposure and malignant lymphoma. Lymphoma is a cancer of the lymph system, which again, we have those lymph vessels in our dermis. There could be a connection there. That's the hypothesis, right? So to do this, they found all incident cases of malignant lymphoma that were diagnosed between 2007 and 2017 in Sweden's cancer registry. And then they sampled 3 random age and sex matched controls from the overall total population registry. Because I guess they do that in Sweden. They have healthcare registries, which is fascinating. And it must be so cool to do research there because you have so much data. But anyway, so from these populations, from the cancer registry and the total population, they sent out a survey and they asked, in 2021, up until 2021, had you had a tattoo exposure? And around 1,400 lymphoma cases responded, and about 4,000 of the controls responded. And they found that in the lymphoma cases, 21% had reported tattoo exposure. And in the control group, so the people that didn't have cancer, 18% reported tattoo exposure. So 21% versus 18% doesn't really seem like that much. But when they calculated the risk ratio, which is a complex mathematical tool that you can use to determine the risk of something based on an exposure, they found that the risk ratio was 21% higher risk of developing lymphoma if you had a tattoo. So essentially they calculate this risk ratio where a ratio of 1 is that each group had an equal risk of developing cancer in this point, or in this example. But here the ratio was 1.21, which means that the people who had a tattoo exposure had a higher risk, 21% higher risk of developing cancer compared to people who did not have a tattoo. And what was also interesting that they found was that the risk was higher for people who were less than 2 years between their first tattoo and the year that they were diagnosed with cancer. So in this time frame between getting a tattoo and the year of developing cancer, in this section of people, the odds ratio was 1.81, or an 81% higher risk of developing cancer after getting a tattoo in your first 2 years. And then after that, the odds kind of go down for a little while. So what I interpret that to mean is that your risk of lymphoma is highest up to 2 years after your first tattoo. And this is a point that, I mean, the whole paper, the authors encourage researchers to look into in greater detail. Because, a population of 1,400 lymphoma cases is a really sizable sample size, but, it's always helpful to have different populations, right? This was just in Sweden. And, they also want just more information to draw stronger conclusions. And it's always good to replicate data, of course, and replicate findings, because if this finding is replicated, it can strengthen the argument that tattoos and cancer are actually associated with one another. And if it is, then it can provide some insight into the mechanisms of how this association is happening. But I want to say, again, the last sentence of this paper, I'm going to quote it directly right now. Causality cannot be conferred from a single epidemiologic study, and the results need to be confirmed by further research. So just because this paper says that there's a 21% higher risk of developing lymphoma if you have a tattoo, does not mean that if you get a tattoo, you are at a 21% higher risk of getting lymphoma. Got it? We're clear on that? So correlation does not imply causation, and only studies with much larger scales, with much better, more specific study criteria and design can determine if and how there is causality between tattoos and cancer. I also wanted to kind of provide some context here, because when I was learning about the odds ratio, I was like, okay, 1.21, like 21% higher risk. That seems like, I don't know, is that a lot? Is that not a lot? I don't know. What does that mean, right? So I thought about, okay, what do I know that causes cancer? Cigarettes. So I looked up, okay, what is the odds ratio of cigarette smoking and lung cancer? So remember the risk ratios in this paper about tattoos and lymphoma. It was like 1.21, 1.81 if you're looking within the first 2 years, right? For context, lung cancer for smokers, the odds ratio from what I saw in my brief review is over 7. Over 7. So they have a 700 times higher risk of developing cancer if you smoke cigarettes. So that kind of puts it into perspective for the tattoo being 21% higher versus 700 for smoking cigarettes. that made me feel better in my brain, at least. And maybe it'll make you feel better too. Maybe it won't. I don't know. That's not my job. Again, sorry. Love ya. Do I? But yeah. So it also, I think, just thinking about tattoos, it's a risk tolerance, right? If you know, okay, there's a 21%, maybe 21% risk is too high for you, right? Then don't get one. Every person's risk tolerance is different. So that's all. And also thinking about carcinogens, I actually did an episode. I don't think I've done an episode on like cancer specifically yet, but I remember when I did my episode about alcohol and alcohol use disorder, I learned for the first time that alcohol is a group 1 carcinogen. Like, it is up there with cigarettes of like, this causes cancer. We have a lot of evidence that it causes cancer. So, people who get tattoos, maybe they are willing to take that risk. People who drink too much wine, at me. Those are risks that you are allowed to take because it's your own body and you can do what you want. Period. Okay. That's all I have to say about that. Do tattoos cause cancer? We don't know. We don't know. That's the answer. We need more data. Sorry if that leaves you wanting more, but that's all I can say at this point in time. Okay. So now we'll go to the takeaways. The takeaways for this episode: remember that tattoos work by injecting ink into the dermal layer of our skin, and it gets stuck there because the macrophages can't chomp it down to clear it. So it just kind of gets stuck there and it hangs out. Getting a tattoo does increase the risk of bacterial and viral infections. However, we can curb that risk by making sure that we get our tattoos in a sterilized environment and making sure that we take care of our tattoos properly and make sure that they're staying clean after getting a tattoo. And then some studies have investigated tattoos in different types of cancer, including skin cancer and lymphoma, but the actual relationship between tattoos and cancers are not really well established at this point. It's not very well understood, and we need more information and more comprehensive studies to better understand if that relationship exists and what the mechanisms are by which that relationship is existing. Okay. Those are the takeaways. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you enjoyed learning about me and my tatted girly lifestyle now. If you liked this episode, I really would appreciate if you liked or rated the episode. And you can also subscribe to the podcast wherever you watch or listen. You can follow the show at sam-splains on Instagram and Twitter and TikTok. And you can also ask a question or submit a request for a future episode topic. You can do that either by DMing me on social media or by using samsplainingscience.com/ask. So I think that's all for me. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely day, and I will talk to you next time. Ciao for now. Bye.